let's start with Chapter 5. It was an almost too perfect morning. Leaving the pub felt like stepping into one of those heavily retouched photos that came loaded as wallpaper on new computers. Streets of artfully decrepit cottages stretched into the distance, giving way to green fields sewn together by meandering rock walls. The whole scene topped by scudding white clouds. But beyond all that, above the houses and fields and sheep doddering around like little puffs of cotton candy, I could see tongues of dense fog licking over the ridge in the distance, where this world ended and the next one began, cold, damp, and sunless. I walked over the ridge and straight into a rain shower. True to form, I had forgotten my rubber boots, and the path was a rapidly deepening ribbon of mud. But getting a little wet seemed vastly preferable to climbing that hill twice in one morning. So I bent my head against the spitting rain and trudged onward. Soon I passed the shack, dim outlines of sheep huddled inside against the chill, and then the mist-shrouded bog, silent and ghostly. I thought about the 2,700-year-old resident of Cairnholm's museum and wondered how many more like him these fields held, undiscovered, arrested in death. How many more had given up their lives here, looking for heaven? By the time I reached the children's home, what had begun as a drizzle was a full-on downpour. There was no time to dally in the house's feral yard and reflect upon its malevolent shape, the way the doorless doorway seemed to swallow me as I dove through it, the way the hall's rain-bloated floorboards gave a little beneath my shoes. I stood wringing water from my shirt and shaking out my hair, and when I was as dry as I was going to get, which was not very, I began to search. For what, I wasn't sure. A box of letters? My grandfather's name scribbled on a wall? It all seemed so unlikely. I roved around peeling up mats of old newspaper and looking under chairs and tables. I imagined uncovering some horrible scene, a tangle of skeletons dressed in fire-blackened rags. But all I found were rooms that had become more outside than inside, characters stripped away by moisture and wind and layers of dirt. The ground floor was hopeless. I went back to the staircase, knowing this time I would have to climb it. The only question was, up or down? One strike against going upstairs was its limited options for quick escape, from squatters or ghouls or whatever else my anxious mind could invent, other than hurling myself from an upper story window. Downstairs had the same problem, and with the added detractor of being dark and me without a flashlight. So, upstairs it was. The steps protested my weight with a symphony of shudders and creaks, but they held, and what I discovered upstairs, compared to the bombed-out ground floor, at least, was like a time capsule. Arranged along a hallway striped with peeling wallpaper, the rooms were in surprisingly good shape. Though one or two had been invaded by mold, where a broken window had let in the rain, the rest were packed with things that seemed only a layer or two of dust away from new. A milled wedge shirt tossed casually over the back of the chair, loose change skimming a nightstand. It was easy to believe that everything was just as the children had left it, as if time had stopped the night they died. I went from room to room, examining their contents like an archaeologist. There were wooden toys moldering in a box, crayons on a windowsill, their colors dulled by the light of 10,000 afternoons. A dollhouse with dolls inside, lifers in an ornate prison. In a modest library, the creep of moisture had bowed the shelves into crooked smiles. I ran my finger along the balding spines, as if considering pulling one out to read. There were classics, like Peter Pan and The Secret Garden, histories written by authors forgotten by history, textbooks of Latin and Greek. In the corner were corralled a few old desks. This had been their classroom, I realized, and Miss Peregrine, their teacher. I tried to open a pair of heavy doors, twisting the handle, but they were swelled shut. So I took a running start and rammed them with my shoulder. They flew open with a rasping shriek, and I fell face first into the next room. As I picked myself up and looked around, I realized that it can only have belonged to Miss Peregrine. It was like a room in Sleeping Beauty's castle, with cobweb candles mounted in wall sconces, a mirrored vanity, table-topped with crystal bottles, and a giant oak bed. I pictured the last time she'd been here, scrambling out from under the sheets in the middle of the night, to the whine of an air raid siren, rounding up the children, all groggy and grasping for coats on their way downstairs. Were you scared? I wondered. Did you hear the planes coming? I began to feel unusual. I imagined I was being watched, that the children were still here, preserved like the bog boy, inside the walls. I could feel them peering at me through cracks and knotholes. I drifted into the next room. Weak light shone through a window. Petals of powder blue wallpaper drooped toward a couple of small beds, still clad in dusty sheets. I knew somehow that this had been my grandfather's room. Why did you send me here? What was it you needed me to see? Then I noticed something beneath one of the beds and knelt down to look. It was an old suitcase. Was this yours? Is it what you carried onto the train the last time you saw your mother and father as your first life was slipped away? I pulled it out and fumbled with its tattered leather straps. I opened it easily, but except for a family of dead beetles, it was empty. I felt empty too, and strangely heavy, like the planet was spinning too fast, heating up gravity, pulling me toward the floor. Suddenly exhausted, I sat on the bed. His bed, maybe. And for reasons I can't quite explain, I stretched out on those filthy sheets and stared at the ceiling. What did you think about lying here at night? Did you have nightmares too? I began to cry. When your parents died, did you know it? Could you feel them go? I cried harder. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't stop myself. So I thought about all those bad things, and I fed it until I was crying so hard I had to gasp for breath between sobs. I thought about how my great-grandparents had starved to death. I thought about their wasted bodies being fed to incinerators because people they knew didn't know hated them. I thought about how the children who lived in this house had burned up and blown apart because a pilot who didn't care pushed a button. I thought about how my grandfather's family had been taken from him, and how, because of that, my dad grew up feeling like he didn't have a dad. And now I had acute stress and nightmares, and was sitting alone in a falling down house and crying hot, stupid tears all over my shirt. All because of a 70-year-old hurt that had somehow been passed down to me like some poisonous heirloom, and monsters I couldn't fight because they were all dead, beyond killing or punishing or any kind of reckoning. At least my grandfather had been able to join the army and go fight them. What could I do? When it was over, my head was pounding. I closed my eyes and pushed my knuckles in to stop them from hurting, if only for a moment. And when I finally released the pressure and opened them again, a miraculous change had come over the room. There was a single ray of sun shining through the window. I got up, went to the cracked glass, and saw that it was both raining and shining outside. A bit of a meteorological weirdness whose name no one can seem to agree on. My mom, I kid you not, refers to it as orphan's tears. Then I remembered what Ricky says about it. The devil's beaten his wife. and I laughed and felt a little better. Then, in a patch of quickly fading sun that fell across the room, I noticed something I hadn't before. It was a trunk, or the edge of one at least, poking out from under the second bed. I went over and peeled back the bedsheet that hid most of it from view. It was a big old steamer trunk, latched with a giant rusting padlock. It couldn't possibly be empty, I thought. You don't lock an empty trunk. "Open me," it fairly seemed to cry out. "I'm full of secrets." I grabbed it by the sides and pulled. It didn't move. I pulled again harder, but it wouldn't give an inch. I wasn't sure if it was just that heavy, or if generations of accumulated moisture and dust had somehow fused it to the floor. I stood up and kicked it a few times, which seemed to jar things loose, and then I managed to move it by pulling on one side at a time, shimmying it forward, the way you might move a stove or a fridge, until it had come out all the way from under the bed, leaving a trail of parenthetical scars on the floor. I yanked on the padlock, but despite a thick incrustation of rust, it seemed to be rock solid. I briefly considered searching for a key. It had to be here somewhere. But I could have wasted hours looking, and the lock was so decayed that I wondered if the key would even work anymore. My only option was to break it. Looking around for something that might do the job, I found a busted chair in one of the other rooms. I pried off a leg and went to town on the lock, raising the leg over my head like an executioner and bringing it down as hard as I could over and over until the leg itself finally broke, and I was left holding a splintered stump. I scanned the room for something stronger and quickly spotted a loose railing on the bed frame. After a few stomping kicks, it clattered to the floor. I wedged one end through the lock and pulled the other end backward. Nothing happened. I hung on it with all my weight, lifting my feet off the floor like I was doing a pull-up with the rail. The trunk creaked a little, but that was it. I started to get mad. I kicked the trunk and pulled on that rail with every bit of my strength, the veins bulging out of my neck, yelling, "Open, goddamn you stupid trunk." Finally, my frustration and anger had an object. If I couldn't make my dead grandfather give up his secrets, I would damn well pry the secrets out of this old trunk. And then the rail slipped, and I crashed to the floor and got the wind knocked out of me. I lay there and stared at the ceiling, catching my breath. The orphan's tears had ended, and now it was just plain old raining outside, harder than ever. I thought about going back to town for a sledgehammer or a hacksaw, but that would only raise questions I didn't feel like answering. Then I had a brilliant idea. If I could find a way to break the trunk, I wouldn't have to worry about the lock at all. And what force would be stronger than me and my admittedly underdeveloped upper body muscles wailing on the trunk with random tools? Gravity. I was, after all, on the second floor of the house. And while I didn't think there was any way I could lift the trunk high enough to get it through a window, the rail along the top of the staircase landing had long ago collapsed. All I had to do was drag the trunk down the hall and push it over. Whether its contents would survive the impact was another issue. But at least I'd find out what was inside. I hunkered down behind the trunk and began pushing it down the hall. After a few inches, its metal feet dug into the soft floor, and it ground stubbornly to a halt. Undeterred, I moved around to the other side, gripping the padlock with both hands, and pulled backward. To my great surprise, it moved 2 or 3 feet in one go. It wasn't a particularly dignified way of working, this squatting, butt-scooting motion I had to repeat over and over, each slide of the trunk accompanied by an ear-splitting metal-on-wood shriek. But before long, I'd gotten it out of the room and was dragging it foot by foot, doorway by doorway, toward the landing. I lost myself in the echoing rhythm of it, working up a manly lather of sweat in the process. I finally made it to the landing, and with one final indelicate grunt, pulled the trunk onto it after me. It slid easily now, and after a few more shoves, I had it teetering precariously on the edge. One last nudge would be enough to send it over. But I wanted to see it shatter, my reward for all this work. So I got up and carefully shuffled toward the edge until I could glimpse the floor of the gloomy chamber below. Then, holding my breath, I gave the trunk a little tap with my foot. It hesitated for a moment, wobbling there on the edge of oblivion, and then pitched decisively forward and fell, tumbling end over end in beautiful, balletic slow motion. There came a tremendous echoing crash that seemed to rattle the whole house as a plume of dust shot up at me from below, and I had to cover my face and retreat down the hall until it cleared. A minute later, I came back and peeked again over the landing, and saw not the pile of smashed wood that I had so fondly hoped for, but a jagged trunk-shaped hole in the floorboards. It had fallen straight through into the basement. I raced downstairs and wriggled up to the edge of the buckled floor on my belly, like you would a hole in thin ice. 15 feet below, through a haze of dust and darkness, I saw what remained of the trunk. It had shattered, like a giant egg, its pieces all mixed up in a heap of debris and smashed floorboards. Scattered throughout were little pieces of paper. It looked like I'd found a box of letters after all. But then, squinting, I could make out shapes on them, faces, bodies. And that's when I realized they weren't letters at all, but photographs. Dozens of them. I got excited and then just as quickly went cold because something dreadful occurred to me. I have to go down there. The basement was a meandering complex of rooms so lightless, I may as well have explored them blindfolded. I descended the creaking stairs and stood at the bottom for a while, hoping my eyes would eventually adjust. But it was the kind of dark there was no adjusting to. I was also hoping I'd get used to the smell, a strange, acrid stink like the supply closet in a chemistry classroom, but no such luck. So I shuffled in, with my shirt collar pulled up over my nose and my hands held out in front of me, and hoped for the best. I tripped and nearly fell. Something made of glass went skidding away across the floor. The only smell seemed to get worse. I began to imagine things lurking in the dark ahead of me. Forget monsters and ghosts. What if there was another hole in the floor? They'd never find my body. Then I realized, in a minor stroke of genius, that by dialing up a menu screen on the cell phone I kept in my pocket, despite being 10 miles from the nearest bar of reception, I could make a weak flashlight. I held it out, aiming the screen away from me. It barely penetrated the darkness, so I pointed it at the floor. Cracked flagstone and mouse turds. I aimed it to the side. A faint gleam reflected back. I took a step closer and swept my phone around. Out of the darkness emerged a wall of shelves lined with glass jars. They were all shapes and sizes, mottled with dust, and filled with gelatinous-looking things suspended in cloudy fluid. I thought of the kitchen and the exploded jars of fruits and vegetables I'd found there. Maybe the temperature was more stable down here, and that's why they had survived. But then I got closer still and looked a little harder and realized they weren't fruits and vegetables at all, but organs, brains, hearts, lungs, eyes, all pickled in some kind of home-brewed formaldehyde, which explained the terrific stench. I gagged and stumbled away from them in the dark, simultaneously grossed out and baffled. What kind of place was this? Those jars were something you might expect to find in the basement of a fly-by-night medical school, not a house full of children. If not for all the wonderful things Grandpa Portman had said about this place, I might have wondered if Miss Peregrine had rescued the children just to harvest their organs. When I'd recovered a little, I looked up to see another gleam ahead of me. Not a reflection of my phone, but a weak glimmer of daylight. It had to be coming from the hole I'd made. I soldiered on, breathing through my pulled-up shirt and keeping away from the walls and any other ghastly surprises they might have harbored. The gleam led me around a corner and into a small room with part of the ceiling caved in. Daylight streamed through the hole onto a mound of splintered floorboards and broken glass from which rose coils of silty dust, pieces of torn carpet plastered here and there, like scraps of desiccated meat. Beneath the debris, I could hear the scrabble of tiny feet, some rodentine dark dweller that had survived the implosion of its world. In the midst of it all lay the demolished trunk, photographs scattered around it like confetti. I picked my way through the wreckage, high-stepping javelins of wood and planks studded with rusting nails. Kneeling, I began to salvage what I could from the pile. I felt like a rescue worker, plucking faces from the debris, brushing away glass and wood rot. And though part of me wanted to hurry, there was no telling if or when the rest of the floor might collapse on my head. I couldn't stop myself from studying them. At first glance, they looked like the kind of pictures you'd find in any old family album. There were shots of people cavorting on beaches and smiling on back porches, vistas from around the island, and lots of kids posing in singles and pairs, informal snapshots and formal portraits taken in front of backdrops, their subjects clutching dead-eyed dolls, like they'd gone to glamour shots in some creepy turn-of-the-century shopping mall. But what I found really creepy wasn't the zombie dolls or the children's weird haircuts or how they never ever seemed to smile, but that the more I studied the pictures, the more familiar they began to seem. They shared a certain nightmarish quality with my grandfather's old photos, especially the ones he'd kept hidden in the bottom of his cigar box, as if somehow they'd all come from the same batch. There was, for instance, a photo of two young women posed before a not terribly convincing painted backdrop of the ocean. Not so strange in and of itself. The unsettling thing was how they were posed. Both had their backs to the camera. Why would you go to all the trouble and expense of having your picture taken? Portraits were pricey back then. And then turn your back on the camera. I half expected to find another photo in the debris of the same girls facing forward, revealing grinning skulls for faces. Other pictures seemed manipulated in much the same way as some of my grandfather's had been. One was of a lone girl in a cemetery staring into a reflecting pool, but two girls were reflecting back. It reminded me of Grandpa Portman's photo of the girl trapped in a bottle. Only whatever darkroom technique had been used wasn't nearly as fake-looking. Another was of a disconcertingly calm young man whose upper body appeared to be swarming with bees. That would be easy enough to fake, right? Like my grandfather's picture of the boy lifting what was certainly a boulder made from plaster. Fake rock, fake bees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I remembered something Grandpa Portman had said about a boy he'd known here in the children's home. A boy with bees living inside him. Some would fly out every time he opened his mouth, he had said, but they never stung unless Hugh wanted them to. I could think of only one explanation. My grandfather's pictures had come from the trunk that lay smashed before me. I wasn't certain, though, until I found a picture of the freaks. Two masked, ruffle-collared kids who seemed to be feeding each other a coil of ribbon. I didn't know what they were supposed to be exactly, besides fuel for nightmares. What were they? Sadomasochistic ballerinas? But there was no doubt in my mind that Grandpa Portman had a picture of these same two boys. I'd seen it in his cigar box just a few months ago. It couldn't have been a coincidence, which meant that the photos my grandfather had showed me, that he'd sworn were children he'd known in this house, had really come from this house. But could that mean, despite the doubts I'd harbored even as an 8-year-old, that the pictures were genuine? What about the fantastic stories that went along with them? That any of them could be true, literally true, seemed unthinkable. And yet, standing there in dusty half-light in that dead house that seemed so alive with ghosts, I thought, maybe. Suddenly, there came a loud crash from somewhere in the house above me, and I startled so badly that all the pictures slipped from my hands. It's just the house settling, I told myself. Or caving in. But as I bent down to gather the photos, the crash came again, and in an instant, what meager light had shone through the hole in the floor faded away, and I found myself squatting in inky darkness. I heard footsteps, and then voices. I strained to make out what they were saying, but I couldn't. I didn't dare move, afraid that the slightest motion would set off a noisy avalanche of debris all around me. I knew that my fear was irrational. It was probably just those dumb rapper kids pulling another prank. But my heart was beating 100 miles an hour, and some deep animal instinct commanded me to be silent. My legs began to go numb. As quietly as I could, I shifted my weight from one leg to the other to get the blood flowing again. A tiny piece of something came loose from the pile and rolled away, making a sound that seemed huge in the silence. The voices went quiet. Then a floorboard creaked right over my head, and a little shower of plaster dust sprinkled down. Whoever was up there, they knew exactly where I was. I held my breath. Then I heard a girl's voice say softly, "Abe, is that you?" I thought I dreamed it. I waited for the girl to speak again, but for a long moment there was only the sound of rain banking off the roof, like 1,000 fingers tapping way off somewhere. Then a lantern glowed to life above me, and I craned my neck to see a half-dozen kids kneeling around the craggy jaws of broken floor, peering down. I recognized them somehow, though I didn't know where from. They seemed like faces from a half-remembered dream. Where had I seen them before? And how did they know my grandfather's name? Then it clicked. Their clothes, strange even for whales. Their pale, unsmiling faces. The pictures strewn before me, staring up at me just as the children stared down. Suddenly, I understood. I'd seen them in the photographs. The girl who'd spoken stood up to get a better look at me. In her hands, she had held a flickering light, which wasn't a lantern or a candle, but seemed to be a ball of raw flame, attended by nothing more than her bare skin. I'd seen her picture not 5 minutes earlier, and in it she looked much the same as she did now, even cradling the same strange light between her hands. "I'm Jacob," I wanted to say. "I've been looking for you." But my jaw had come unhinged, and all I could do was stare. The girl's expression soured. I was wretched looking, damp from rain and dust-covered and squatting in a mound of debris. Whatever she and the other children had been expecting to find inside this hole in the floor, I was not it. A murmur passed among them, and they stood up and quickly scattered. Their sudden movement knocked something loose in me, and I found my voice again and shouted for them to wait. But they were already pounding the floorboards toward the door. I tripped through the wreckage and stumbled blindly across the stinking basement to the stairs. But by the time I made it to the back to the ground floor, where the daylight they'd stolen had somehow returned, they had vanished from the house. I bolted outside and down the crumbling brick steps into the grass, screaming, "Wait, stop!" But they were gone. I scanned the yard, the woods, breathing hard, cursing myself. Something snapped beyond the trees. I wheeled around to look and, through a screen of branches, caught a flash of blurred movement, the hem of a white dress. It was her. I crashed into the woods, sprinting after. She took off running down the path. I hurdled fallen logs and ducked low branches, chasing her until my lungs burned. She kept trying to lose me, cutting from the path into the trackless forest and back. Finally, the woods fell away, and we broke into open bogland. I saw my chance. Now she had nowhere to hide. To catch her, I had only to pour on the speed, and with me in sneakers and jeans, and her in a dress, it would be no contest. Just as I started to catch up, though, she made a sudden turn and plunged straight into the bog. I had no choice but to follow. Running became impossible. The ground couldn't be trusted. It kept giving away, tripping me into knee-deep bog holes that soaked my pants and sucked at my legs. The girl, though, seemed to know just where to step, and she pulled farther and farther away, finally disappearing into the mist so that I had only her footprints to follow. After she'd lost me, I kept expecting her prints to veer back toward the path, but they plowed ever deeper into the bog. Then the mist closed behind me, and I couldn't see the path anymore, and I began to wonder if I'd ever find my way out. I tried calling to her. "My name is Jacob Portman. I'm Abe's grandson. I won't hurt you." But the fog and the mud seemed to swallow my voice. Her footprints led to a mound of stones. It looked like a big gray igloo, but it was a cairn, one of the Neolithic tombs after which Cairnholm was named. The cairn was a little taller than me, long and narrow, with a rectangular opening in one end, like a door, and it rose from the mud on a tussock of grass. Climbing out of the mire onto the relatively solid ground that ringed it, I saw that the opening was the entrance to a tunnel that burrowed deep inside. Intricate loops and spirals had been carved on either side, ancient hieroglyphs, the meaning of which had been lost to the ages. Here lies Bog Boy, I thought. Or more likely, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. But enter I did, because that's where the girl's footprints led. Inside the cairn tunnel was damp and narrow and profoundly dark, so cramped that I could only move forward in a kind of hunchbacked crab walk. Luckily, enclosed spaces were not one of the many things that scared the hell out of me. Imagining the girl frightened and trembling somewhere up ahead, I talked to her as I went along, doing my best to reassure her that I meant no harm. My words came slapping back at me in a disorienting echo. Just as my thighs were starting to ache from the bizarre posture I'd been forced to adopt, the tunnel widened into a chamber, pitch black, but big enough that I could stand and stretch my arms to either side without touching a wall. I pulled out my phone and once more pressed it into service as a makeshift flashlight. It didn't take long to size up the place. It was a simple, stone-walled chamber about as large as my bedroom, and it was completely empty. There was no girl to be found. I was standing there trying to figure out how the hell she'd managed to slip by when something occurred to me. Something so obvious that I felt like a fool for having taken this long to realize it. There never was any girl. I'd imagined her, and the rest of them too. My brain had conjured them up at the very moment I was looking at their pictures. And the sudden strange darkness that had preceded their arrival? A blackout. It was impossible anyway. Those kids had all died a lifetime ago. Even if they hadn't, it was ridiculous to believe they would still look exactly as they had when the photos were taken. Everything had happened so quickly, though. I never had a chance to stop and wonder if I might be chasing a hallucination. I could already predict Dr. Golan's explanation. That house is such an emotionally loaded place for you. Just being inside was enough to trigger a stress reaction. Yeah, he was a psychobabble-spewing prick, but that didn't make him wrong. I turned back, humiliated. Rather than crab walking, I let go of the last of my dignity and just crawled on my hands and knees toward the gauzy light coming from the mouth of the tunnel. Looking up, I realized I'd seen this view before, in a photograph in Martin's museum of the place where they discovered the bog boy. It was baffling to think that people had once believed this foul-smelling wasteland was a gateway to heaven, and believed it with such conviction that a kid my age was willing to give up his life to get there. What a sad, stupid waste. I decided then that I wanted to go home. I didn't care about the photos in the basement, and I was sick of riddles and mysteries and last words. Indulging my grandfather's obsession with them had made me worse, not better. It was time to let go. I unfolded myself from the cramped cairn tunnel and stepped outside only to be blinded by light. Shielding my eyes, I squinted through split fingers at a world I hardly recognized. It was the same bog and the same path and the same everything as before. But for the first time since my arrival, it was bathed in a cheery yellow sunlight. The sky a candy blue. No trace of the twisting fog that, for me, had come to define this part of the island. It was warm, too. More like the dog days of summer than the breezy beginnings of it. God, the weather changes fast around here, I thought. I slogged back to the path, trying to ignore the skin-crawly feeling of bog mud gushing into my socks, and headed for town. Strangely, the path wasn't muddy at all, as if it had dried out in just a few minutes. But it had been carpet-bombed with so many grapefruit-sized animal turds that I couldn't walk in a straight line. How had I not noticed this earlier? Had I been in some kind of psychotic haze all morning? Was I in one now? I didn't look up from the turdy checkerboard that stretched out before me until I crossed the ridge and was coming back into town, which is when I realized where all the mess had come from. Where this morning a battalion of tractors had plied the gravel paths, hauling carts loaded with fish and peat bricks up and down the harbor, now those carts were being pulled by horses and mules. The clip-clop of hooves had replaced the growl of engines. Missing, too, was the ever-present buzz of diesel generators. Had the island run out of gas in the few hours I'd been gone? And where had the townspeople been hiding all these big animals? Also, why was everyone looking at me? Every person I passed stared at me, goggle-eyed, stopping whatever they were doing to rubberneck as I walked by. I must look as crazy as I feel, I thought, glancing down to see that I was covered in mud from the waist down and plaster from the waist up. So I ducked my head and walked as fast as I could toward the pub, where at least I could hide in the anonymous gloom until Dad came back for lunch. I decided that when he did, I would tell him straight out that I wanted to go home as soon as possible. If he hesitated, I would admit that I'd been hallucinating and would be on the next ferry guaranteed. Inside the hole were the usual collection of inebriated men bent over foamy pint glasses, and the battered tables and dingy decor I'd come to know as my home away from home. But as I headed for the staircase, I heard an unfamiliar voice bark, "Where do you think you're going?" I turned, one foot on the bottom step, to see the bartender looking me up and down. Only it wasn't Kev, but a scowling, bullet-headed man I didn't recognize. He wore a bartender's apron and had a bushy unibrow and a caterpillar mustache that made his face look striped. I might have said, "I'm going upstairs to pack my suitcase, and if my dad still won't take me home, I'm going to fake a seizure." But instead, I answered, "Just up to my room," which came out sounding more like a question than a statement of fact. "That's so," he said, clapping down the glass he'd been filling. "This look like a hotel to you?" Wooden creaks as patrons swiveled around in their stools to get a look at me. I quickly scanned their faces. Not one of them looked familiar. I'm having a psychotic episode, I thought. Right now. This is what a psychotic episode feels like. Only, it didn't feel like anything. I wasn't seeing lightning bolts or having palm sweats. It was more like the world was going crazy, not me. I told the bartender that there must obviously had been a mistake. "My dad and I have the upstairs rooms," I said. "Look, I've got the key." And I produced it from my pocket as evidence. "Let me see that," he said, leaning over the counter to snatch it out of my hand. He held it up to the dingy light, eyeing it like a jeweler. "This ain't our key," he growled, then slipped it into his own pocket. "Now tell me what you really want up there, and this time, don't lie." I felt my face go hot. I'd never been called a liar by a non-relative adult before. "I told you already, we rented those rooms. Just ask Kev if you don't believe me." "I don't know no Kev, and I don't fancy being fed stories," he said coolly. "There ain't any rooms to be let around here, and the only one lives upstairs is me." I looked around, expecting someone to crack a smile, to let me in on the joke, but the men's faces were like stone. "He's American," observed a man sporting a prodigious beard. "Army, could be." "Bollocks," another one growled. "Look at him. He's practically a fetus." "His Mac, though," the bearded one said, reaching out to pinch the sleeve of my jacket. "You'd have a hell of a time finding that in any shop. Army, gotta be." "Look," I said, "I'm not in the Army, and I'm not trying to pull anything on you, I swear. I just want to find my dad, get my stuff, and—" "American my arse," bellowed a fat man. He peeled his considerable girth off a stool to stand between me and the door, toward which I'd been slowly backing. His accent sounds rubbish to me. I'll wager he's a Jerry spy. "I'm not a spy," I said weakly. "Just lost." "Got that right," he said with a laugh. "I say we get the truth out of him the old-fashioned way, with a rope." Drunken shouts of assent. I couldn't tell if they were being serious or just taking the piss, but I didn't much care to stick around and find out. One undiluted instinct coursed through the anxious muddle in my brain. Run. It would be a lot easier to figure out what the hell was going on without a room full of drunks threatening to lynch me. Of course, running away would only convince them of my guilt, but I didn't care. I tried to step around the fat man. He made a grab for me, but slow and drunk is no match for fast and scared shitless. I faked left and dodged around him to the right. He howled with rage as the rest unglued themselves from bar stools to lunge at me, but I slipped through their fingers and ran out the door and into the bright afternoon. I charged down the street, my feet pounding divots into the gravel, the angry voices gradually fading behind me. At the first corner, I made a skidding turn to escape their line of sight, cutting through a muddy yard where squawking chickens dove out of my way, and then an open lot where a line of women stood waiting to pump water from an old well, their heads turning as I flew past. A thought I had no time to entertain flitted through my head. Hey, where'd the waiting woman go? But then I came to a low wall and had to concentrate on vaulting it. Plant the hand, lift the feet, swing over. I landed in a busy path where I was nearly run down by a speeding cart. The driver yelled something derogatory about my mother as his horse's flank brushed my chest, leaving hoof prints and a wheel tracks just inches from my toes. I had no idea what was happening. I understood only two things: that I was quite possibly in the midst of losing my mind, and that I needed to get away from people until I could figure out whether or not I actually was. To that end, I dashed into an alley behind 2 rows of cottages, where it seemed there would be lots of hiding places, and made for the edge of town. I slowed to a fast walk, hoping that a muddy and bedraggled American boy who was not running would attract somewhat less attention than one who was. My attempt to act normal was not helped by the fact that every little noise or fleeting movement made me jump. I nodded and waved to a woman hanging laundry, but like everyone else, she just stared at me. I walked faster. I heard a strange noise behind me and ducked into an outhouse. As I waited there, hunkering behind the half-closed door, my eyes scanned the graffitied walls. Dooley's a bugger-loving arse-humper. What? No sugar? Finally, a dog slinked by, trailed by a litter of yapping puppies. I let out my breath and began to relax a little. Collecting my nerves, I stepped back into the alley. Something grabbed me by the hair. Before I'd even had a chance to cry out, a hand whipped around from behind and pressed something sharp to my throat. "Scream and I'll cut you," came a voice. Keeping the blade to my neck, my assailant pushed me against the outhouse wall and stepped around to face me. To my great surprise, it wasn't one of the men from the pub. It was the girl. She wore a simple white dress and a hard expression, her face strikingly pretty, even though she appeared to be giving serious thought to gouging out my windpipe. "What are you?" she hissed. American?" I stammered, not quite sure what she was asking. "I'm Jacob." She pressed the knife harder against my throat, her hand shaking. She was scared, which meant she was dangerous. "What were you doing in the house?" she demanded. "Why are you chasing me?" "I just wanted to talk to you. Please don't kill me." She fixed me with a scowl. "Talk to me about what?" "About the house. About the people who lived there." "Who sent you here?" "My grandfather. His name was Abraham Portman." Her mouth fell open. "That's a lie," she cried, her eyes flashing. "You think I don't know what you are? I wasn't born yesterday. Open your eyes. Let me see your eyes." "I am. They are." I opened my eyes as wide as I could. She stood on tiptoes and stared into them, then stamped her foot and shouted, "No, your real eyes. Those fakes don't fool me any more than your ridiculous lie about Abe." "It's not a lie, and these are my eyes." She was pushing so hard against my windpipe that it was difficult to breathe. I was glad the knife was dull, or she surely would have cut me. "Look, I'm not whatever it is you think I am," I croaked. "I can prove it." Her hand relaxed a little. "Then prove it, or I'll water the grass with your blood." "I have something right here." I reached into my jacket. She leapt back and shouted at me to stop, raising her blade so that it hung quivering in the air just between my eyes. "It's only a letter. Calm down." She lowered the blade to my throat, and I slowly drew Miss Peregrine's letter and photo from my jacket, holding for her to see. "The letter's part of the reason I came here. My grandfather gave it to me. It's from the bird. That's what you call your headmistress, isn't it?" "This doesn't prove anything," she said. though she'd hardly glanced at it. "And how do you know so bloody much about us?" "I told you, my grandfather—" She slapped the letter out of my hands. "I don't want to hear another word of that rubbish." Apparently, I'd touched a nerve. She went quiet for a moment, face pinched with frustration, as if she were deciding how best to dispose of my body once she followed through on her threats. Before she could decide, though, shouts erupted from the other end of the alley. We turned to see the men from the pub running toward us, armed with wooden clubs and farm implements. "What's this? What have you done?" "You're not the only person who wants to kill me." She took the knife from my throat and held it at my side instead, then grabbed me by the collar. "You are now my prisoner. Do exactly as I say or you'll regret it." I made no argument. I didn't know if my chances were better in the hands of this unbalanced girl than with that slavering mob of club-wheeling drunks, but at least with her, I figured I had a shot getting some answers. She shoved me, and I stumbled to snatch the letter from the ground, and we were off and running down a connecting alley. Halfway to the end, she darted to one side and pulled me after her, both of us ducking under a line of sheets and hopping a chicken wire fence into the yard of the little cottage. "In here," she whispered, and looking around to make sure we hadn't been seen, pushed me through a door into a cramped hovel that reeked of peat smoke. There was no one inside, save an old dog asleep on a sofa. He opened one eye to look at us, didn't think much of what he saw, and went back to sleep. We darted to a window that looked out on the street and flattened ourselves against the wall next to it. We stood there, listening, the girl careful to keep a hand on my arm and her knife at my side. A minute passed. The men's voices seemed to fade and then return. It was hard to tell where they were. My eyes drifted around the little room. It seemed excessively rustic, even for Cairnholm. Tilting in a corner was a stack of hand-woven baskets. A chair upholstered in burlap stood before a giant coal-fired cooking range cast from iron. Hung on the opposite wall was a calendar, and though it was too dim to read from where we stood, just looking at it sparked a bizarre thought. "What year is it?" The girl told me to shut up. "I'm serious," I whispered. She regarded me strangely for a moment. "I don't know what you're playing at, but go have a look for yourself," she said, pushing me toward the calendar. The top half was a black and white photo of a tropical scene, full-bodied girls with enormous bangs and vintage-looking swimsuits smiling on a beach. Printed above the seam was September 1940. The first and second days of the month had been crossed out. A detached numbness spread over me. I considered all the strange things I'd seen that morning. The bizarre and sudden change in the weather. The island I thought I'd known, now populated by strangers. How the style of everything around me looked old, but the things themselves were new. It could all be explained by the calendar on the wall. September 3rd, 1940. But how? And then one of the last things my grandfather said came to me. On the other side of the old man's grave. It was something I'd never been able to figure out. There was a time I'd wondered if he meant ghosts, that since all the children he'd known here were dead, I'd have to go to the other side of the grave to find them. But that was too poetic. My grandfather was literal-minded, not a man who traded in metaphor or suggestion. He'd given me straightforward directions that he simply hadn't had time to explain. The old man, I realized, was what the locals called the bog boy, and his grave was the cairn. And earlier today, I had gone inside it and came out someplace else. September 3rd, 1940. All this occurred to me in the time it took for the room to turn upside down and my knees to go out from under me, and for everything to fade into pulsing, velvety black. I awoke on the floor with my hands tied to the cooking range. The girl was pacing nervously and appeared to be having an animated conversation with herself. I kept my eyes most of the way shut and listened. "He must be a white," she was saying. "Why else would he have been snooping around the old house like a burglar?" "I haven't the slightest idea," someone else said. "But neither, it seems, does he." So she wasn't talking to herself after all, though from where I was lying, I couldn't see the young man who'd spoken. "You say he didn't even realize he was in a loop?" "See for yourself," she said, gesturing toward me. "Can you imagine any relative of Abe's being so perfectly clueless?" "Can you imagine a white?" said the young man. I turned my head slightly, scanning the room, but I still didn't see him. "I can imagine a white faking it," the girl replied. The dog, awake now, trotted over and began to lick my face. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to ignore it, but the tongue bath he gave me was so slobbery and gross that I finally had to sit up just to rescue myself. "Well, look who's up," the girl said. She clapped her hands, giving me a sarcastic round of applause. "That was quite the performance you gave earlier. I particularly enjoyed the fainting. I'm sure the theater lost a fine actor when you chose to devote yourself instead to murder and cannibalism." I opened my mouth to protest my innocence and stopped when I noticed a cup floating toward me. "Have some water," the young man said. "Can't have you dying before we get you back to the headmistress now, can we?" His voice seemed to come from the empty air. I reached for the cup, and as my pinky brushed an unseen hand, I nearly dropped it. "He's clumsy," the young man said. "You're invisible," I replied dumbly. "Indeed. Millard Nulling's at your service." "Don't tell him your name," the girl cried. "And this is Emma," he continued. "She's a bit paranoid, as I'm sure you've gathered." Emma glared at him, or at the space I imagined him to occupy, but said nothing. The cup shook in my hand. I began another fumbling attempt to explain myself, but was interrupted by angry voices from outside the window. "Quiet," Emma hissed. Millard's footsteps moved closer to the window, and the blinds parted an inch. "What's happening?" asked Emma. "They're searching the houses," he replied. "We can't stay here much longer." "Well, we can't very well go out there." "I think perhaps we can," he said. "Just to be certain, though, let me consult my book." The blinds fell close again, and I saw a small leather-bound notebook rise from a table and crack open in midair. Millard hummed as he flipped the pages. A minute later, he snapped the book shut. "As I suspected," he said. "We have only to wait a minute or so, and then we can walk straight out the front door." "Are you mad?" Emma said. "We'll have every one of those knuckle-draggers on us with brick bats." "Not if we're less interesting than what's about to happen," he replied. "I assure you, this is the best opportunity we'll have for hours." I was untied from the range and led to the door, where we crouched, waiting. Then came a noise from outside, even louder than the men's shouting. Engines. Dozens by the sound of it. "Oh, Millard, that's brilliant," cried Emma. He sniffed. "And you said my studies were a waste of time." Emma put her hand on the doorknob and then turned to me. "Take my arm. Don't run. Act like nothing's the matter." She put away her knife, but assured me that if I tried to escape, I'd see it again, just before she killed me with it. "How do I know you won't anyway?" She thought for a moment. "You don't." And then she pushed open the door. The street outside was thronged with people. Not only the men from the pub, whom I spotted immediately just down the block, but grim-faced shopkeepers and women and cart drivers who'd stopped what they were doing to stand in the middle of the road and crane their heads toward the sky. There, not far overhead, a squadron of Nazi fighter planes were roaring by in perfect formation. I'd seen photos of planes like these at Martin's museum, in a display titled Cairnholm Under Siege. How strange it must be, I thought, to find yourself in the midst of an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, suddenly in the shadow of enemy death machines that could rain fire down upon you at a moment's notice. We crossed the street as casually as possible, Emma clutching my arm in a death grip. We nearly made it to the alley on the other side before someone finally noticed us. I heard a shout, and we turned to see the men start after us. We ran. The alley was narrow and lined with stables. We'd covered half of its length when I heard Millard say, "I'll hang back and trip them up. Meet me behind the pub in precisely 5.5 minutes." His footsteps fell away behind us, and when we'd reached the end of the alley, Emma stopped me. We looked back to see a length of rope uncoil itself and float across the gravel at ankle height. It pulled taut just as the mob reached, and they went sprawling over and into the mud, a tangled heap of flailing limbs. Emma let out a cheer, and I was almost certain I could hear Millard laughing. We ran on. I didn't know why Emma had agreed to meet Millard at the priest hole, since it was in the direction of the harbor, not the house. But since I also couldn't explain how Millard had known exactly when those planes were going to fly over, I didn't bother asking. I was even more baffled when, instead of sneaking around the back, any hope of our passing undetected was dashed by Emma pushing me right through the front door. There was no one inside but the bartender. I turned and hid my face. "Barman," Emma said, "when's the tap open round here? I'm thirsty as a bloodied mermaid." He laughed. "I ain't in the custom of serving little girls." "Never mind that," she cried, slapping her hand on the bar. "Pour me a quadruple dram of your finest cask-strength whiskey, and none of that frightful watered-down piss you generally serve." I began to get the feeling she was just messing around. Taking the piss, I should say. Trying to one-up Millard and his rope across the alley trick. The bartender leaned across the bar. "So it's the hard stuff you're wanting, is it?" he said, grinning lecherously. "Just don't let your mom and dad hear, or I'll have the priest and constable after me both." He fetched a bottle of something dark and evil-looking, and began pouring her a tumbler full. "What about your friend here? Drunk as a deacon already, I suppose." I pretended to study the fireplace. "Shy one, ain't he?" said the barman. "Where's he from?" "Says he's from the future," Emma replied. "I say he's mad as a box of weasels." A strange look came over the bartender's face. "Says he's what?" he asked. And then he must have recognized me because he gave a shout, slammed down the whiskey bottle, and began to scrabble toward me. I was poised to run, but before the bartender could even get out from behind the bar, Emma had upended the drink he'd poured her, spilling brown liquor everywhere. Then she did something amazing. She held her hand palm side down, just above the alcohol-soaked bar, and a moment later, a wall of foot-high flames erupted. The bartender howled and began beating at the wall of fire with his towel. "This way, prisoner," Emma announced, and hooking my arm, she pulled me toward the fireplace. "Now, give me a hand, pry and lift." She knelt and wedged her fingers into a crack that ran along the floor. I jammed my fingers in beside hers, and together we lifted a small section, revealing a hole about the width of my shoulders. The priest hole. As smoke filled the room and the bartender struggled to put out the flames, we lowered ourselves down, one after another, and disappeared. The priest hole was little more than a shaft that dropped about 4 feet to a crawl space. It was pure black down there, but the next thing I knew, it was filled with a soft orange light. Emma had made a torch of her hand, a tiny ball of flame that seemed to hover just above her palm. I gaped at it, all else forgotten. "Move it," she barked, giving me a shove. "There's a door up ahead." I shuffled forward until the crawl space came to a dead end. Then Emma pushed past me, sat down on her butt, and kicked the wall with both heels. It fell open into daylight. "There you are," I heard Millard say as we crawled into an alley. "Can't resist a spectacle, can you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," replied Emma, though I could tell she was pleased with herself. Millard led us to a horse-drawn wagon that seemed to be waiting just for us. We crawled into the back, stowing away beneath a tall tarpaulin. In what seemed like no time, a man walked up and climbed onto the horse, flicked its reins, and we lurched into juddering motion. We rode in silence for a while. I could tell from the changing noises around us that we were headed out of town. I worked up the courage to ask a question. "How'd you know about the wagon? And the planes? Are you psychic or something?" Emma snickered. "Hardly." "Because it all happened yesterday," Millard answered. "And the day before that. Isn't that how things go in your loop?" "My what?" "He isn't from any loop," Emma said, keeping her voice low. "I keep telling you, he's a damn white." "I think not. A white never would have let you take him alive." "See," I whispered, "I'm not a whatever you said. I'm Jacob." "We'll just see about that. Now keep quiet." And she reached up and peeled back the tarpaulin a little, revealing a blue stripe of shifting sky. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. When the last cottages had disappeared behind us, we slipped quietly from the wagon and then crossed the ridge on foot in the direction of the forest. Emma walked on one side of me, silent and brooding, never letting go of my arm, while on the other, Millard hummed to himself and kicked at stones. I was nervous and baffled and queasily excited all at the same time, but part of me felt like something momentous was about to happen. The other part of me expected to wake up at any moment, to come out of this fever dream or stress episode, or whatever it was, and wake up with my face in a puddle of drool on the Smart Aid break room table and think, well, that was strange, and then return to the old, boring business of being me. But I didn't wake up. We just kept walking. The girl who could make fire with her hands, and the invisible boy, and me. We walked through the woods, where the path was as wide and clear as any trail in a national park, then emerged onto a broad expanse of lawn, blooming with flowers and striped with neat gardens. We'd reached the house. I gazed at it in wonder, not because it was awful, but because it was beautiful. There wasn't a shingle out of place or a broken window. Turrets and chimneys that had slumped lazily on the house I remembered now pointed confidently toward the sky. The forest that had seemed to devour its walls stood at a respectful distance. I was led down a flagstone path and up a set of freshly painted steps to the porch. Emma no longer seemed to regard me as the threat she once did, but before going inside, she tied my hands behind me. I think just for the sake of appearances. She was playing the returning hunter, and I was the captured prey. She was about to take me inside when Millard stopped her. "His shoes are caked with filth," he said. "Can't have him tracking in mud. The bird'll have an attack." As my captors waited, I stepped out of my shoes one at a time, pressing down on the heels with the opposite foot, wobbling and nearly losing my balance without any arms to steady me. Emma grabbed me before I could fall, then yanked me impatiently through the door. We proceeded down a hall I remembered being almost impassably clogged with broken furniture, past the staircase, now gleaming with varnish, curious faces peeking at me through the banisters, through the dining room. The snowfall of plaster was gone. In its place was a long wooden table ringed by chairs. It was the same house I'd explored, but everything had been restored to order. When I remembered patinas of green mold, there was wallpaper and wainscoting and cheerful shades of paint. Flowers were arranged in vases. Sagging piles of rotted wood and fabric had rebuilt themselves into fainting couches and armchairs, and sunlight streamed through high windows once so grimy I thought they were blacked out. Finally, we came to a small room that looked out onto the back. "Keep hold of him while I inform the headmistress," Emma said to Millard, and I felt his hand grasp my elbow. When she left, it fell away. "You're not afraid I'll eat your brain or something?" I asked him. "Not particularly." I turned to the window and gazed out in wonder. The yard was full of children, almost all of whom I recognized from yellowed photographs. Some lazed under shade trees, others tossed a ball and chased one another past flower beds exploding with color. It was exactly the paradise my grandfather had described. This was the enchanted island. These were the magical children. If I was dreaming, I no longer wanted to wake up, or at least not anytime soon. Out on the grassy pitch, someone kicked a ball too hard, and it flew up into a giant topiary animal and got stuck. Arranged all in a row were several of these animal bushes, fantastic creatures as tall as the house, standing guard against the woods, including a winged griffin, a rearing centaur, and a mermaid. Chasing after their lost ball, a pair of teenage boys ran to the base of the centaur, followed by a young girl. I instantly recognized her as the levitating girl from my grandfather's pictures. Only now she wasn't levitating. She walked slowly, every plodding step a chore, anchored to the ground as if by some surplus of gravity. When she reached the boys, she raised her arms and they looped a rope around her waist. She slipped carefully out of her shoes and then bobbed in the air like a balloon. It was astonishing. She rose up until the rope around her waist went taut, then hovered 10 feet above the ground, held by the two boys. The girl said something, and the boys nodded and began letting out the rope. She rose slowly up the side of the centaur. When she was level with its chest, she reached into the branches for the ball, but it was stuck deep inside. She looked down and shook her head, and the boys reeled her down to the ground, where she stepped back into her weighted shoes and untied the rope. "Enjoying the show?" asked Millard. I nodded silently. "There are far easier ways to retrieve that ball," he said, "but they know they have an audience." Outside, a second girl was approaching the centaur. She was in her late teens and wild-looking, her hair a nest well on its way to becoming dreadlocks. She bent down, took hold of the topiary's long leafy tail, and it wrapped it around her arm, then closed her eyes as if concentrating. A moment later, I saw the centaur's hand move. I stared through the glass, fixed on that patch of green, thinking it must have been the breeze. But then each of its fingers flexed, as if sensation were slowly returning to them. I watched, astonished, as the centaur's huge arm bent at the elbow, reached into its own chest, plucked out the ball, and tossed it back to the cheering kids. As the game resumed, the wild-haired girl dropped the centaur's tail, and it went still once more. Millard's breath fogged the window by me. I turned to him in amazement. I don't mean to be rude, I said, but what are you people? We're peculiar, he replied, sounding a bit puzzled. Aren't you? I don't know. I don't think so. That's a shame. Why have you let go of him? A voice behind us demanded, and I turned to see Emma standing in the doorway. Oh, never mind, she said, coming over to grab the rope. Come on, the headmistress will see you now. We walked through the house, past more curious eyes peeping through door cracks, and from behind sofas, and into a sunny sitting room, where on an elaborate Persian rug, in a high-backed chair, a distinguished-looking lady sat knitting. She was dressed head to toe in black, her hair pinned in a perfectly round knot atop her head, with lace gloves and a high-collared blouse fastened tightly at her throat. As fastidiously neat as the house itself. I could have guessed who she was, even if I hadn't remembered her picture from those I'd found in the smashed trunk. This was Miss Peregrine. Emma guided me onto the rug and cleared her throat, and the steady rhythm of Miss Peregrine's needles came to a halt. Good afternoon, the lady said, looking up. You must be Jacob. Emma gaped at her. How do you know his... My name is Headmistress Peregrine, she said, holding up a finger to silence Emma. Or if you prefer, since you are not currently under my care, Miss Peregrine. Pleased to finally meet you. Miss Peregrine dangled a gloved hand in my direction, and when I failed to take it, noticed the rope that bound my wrists. Miss Bloom, she cried, what is the meaning of this? Is that any way to treat a guest? Free him at once. But headmistress, he's a snoop and a liar, and I don't know what else. Casting a mistrustful glance at me, Emma whispered something in Miss Peregrine's ear. Why, Miss Bloom, Miss Peregrine, letting out a booming laugh. What undiluted balderdash. If this boy were a white, you'd already be stewing in his soup kettle. Of course he's Abraham Portman's grandson. Just look at him. I felt a flush of relief. Maybe I wouldn't have to explain myself after all. She'd been expecting me. Emma began to protest, but Miss Peregrine shut her down with a withering glare. Oh, all right, Emma sighed. But don't say I didn't warn you. And with a few tugs at the knot, the rope fell away. You'll have to pardon Miss Bloom, said Miss Peregrine, as I rubbed at my chafed wrists. She has a certain flair for the dramatic. So I've noticed. Emma scowled. If he's who he says he is, then why doesn't he know the first thing about loops, or even what year he's in? Go on, ask him. Why doesn't he know? Miss Peregrine corrected. And the only person whom I'll be subjecting to questioning is you, tomorrow afternoon, regarding the proper use of grammatical tenses. Emma groaned. Now, if you don't mind, Miss Peregrine said, I need to have a word with Mr. Portman in private. The girl knew it was useless to argue. She sighed and went to the door, but before leaving, turned to give me one last look over her shoulder. On her face was an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Concern. You too, Mr. Nullings, Miss Peregrine called out. Polite persons do not eavesdrop on the conversations of others. I was only lingering to inquire if you should like some tea, said Millard, who I got the feeling was a bit of a suck-up. We should not, thank you, Miss Peregrine answered curtly. I heard Millard's bare feet slap across the floorboards, and the door swung shut behind him. I would ask you to sit, said Miss Peregrine, gesturing at a cushy chair behind me, but you appear to be encrusted with filth. Instead, I knelt on the floor, feeling like a pilgrim begging advice from an all-knowing oracle. You've been on the island for several days now, Miss Peregrine said. Why have you dawdled so long before paying us a visit? I didn't know you were here, I said. How do you know I was? I've been watching you. You've seen me as well, though perhaps you didn't realize it. I had assumed my alternate form. She reached up and pulled a long gray feather from her hair. It's vastly preferable to assume the shape of a bird when observing humans, she explained. My jaw dropped. That was you in my room this morning? I said. The hawk? The falcon, she corrected. A peregrine, naturally. Then it's true, I said. You are the bird. It's a moniker I tolerate but do not encourage, she replied. Now to my question, continued Miss Peregrine. What on earth were you searching for in that depressing old wreck of a house? You, I replied, and her eyes widened a bit. I didn't know how to find you. I only figured out yesterday that you were all... And then I paused, realizing how strange my next words would sound. I didn't realize you were dead. She flashed me a tight smile. My goodness, hasn't your grandfather told you anything about his old friends? Some things, but for a long time I thought they were fairy tales. I see, she replied. I hope that doesn't offend you. It's a little surprising, that's all. But in general, that is how we prefer to be thought of, for it tends to keep away unwanted visitors. These days, fewer and fewer people believe in those things, fairies and goblins and all such nonsense, and thus common folk no longer make such an effort to seek us out. That makes our lives a good bit easier. Ghost stories and scary old houses have served us well, too, though not apparently in your case. She smiled. Lion-heartedness must run in your family. Yeah, I guess so, I said with a nervous laugh, though in truth I felt as if I might pass out at any moment. In any case, as regards this place, she said, gesturing grandly, as a child, you believed your grandfather was making it all up, as they say? Feeding you a great walloping pack of lies? Is that right? Not lies exactly, but fictions, whoppers, paradiddles, whatever terminology you like. When did you realize Abraham was telling you the truth? Well, I said, staring at the labyrinth of interlocking patterns woven into the carpet. I guess I'm just realizing it now. Miss Peregrine, who had been so animated, seemed to fade a little. Oh my, I see. And then her expression turned grim, as if, in the brief silence between us, she had intuited that terrible thing I'd come to tell her. And yet I still had to find a way to say it out loud. I think he wanted to explain everything, I said, but he waited too long. So he sent me here to find you instead. I pulled the crumpled letter out of my jacket. This is yours. It's what brought me here. She smoothed it carefully over the arm of her chair and held it up, moving her lips as she read. How ungraceful. The way I practically beg him for a reply. She shook her head, wistful for a moment. We were always so desperate for news of Abe. I asked him once if he should like to worry me to death, the way he insisted on living out in the open like that. He could be so deucedly stubborn. She refolded the letter into its envelope, and a dark cloud seemed to pass over her. He's gone, isn't he? I nodded. Haltingly, I told her what happened. That is, I told her the story the cops had settled on, and that, after a great deal of counseling, I too had come to believe. To keep from crying, I gave her only the broad strokes. He lived on the rural outskirts of town. We'd just been through a drought, and the woods were full of starving, desperate animals. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He shouldn't have been living alone, I explained. But like you said, he was stubborn. I was afraid of this, she said. I warned him not to leave. She made tight fists around the knitting needles in her lap, as if considering who to stab with them. And then to make his poor grandson bear the awful news back to us. I could understand her anger. I'd been through it myself. I tried to comfort her, reciting all the reassuring half-truths my parents and Dr. Golan had spun during my blackest moments last fall. It was time for him to go. He was lonely. My grandma had been dead a lot of years already, and his mind wasn't sharp anymore. He was always forgetting things, getting mixed up. That's why he was out in the woods in the first place. Miss Peregrine nodded sadly. He let himself grow old. He was lucky in a way. It wasn't long and drawn out. No months in a hospital hooked up to machines. That was ridiculous, of course. His death had been needless, obscene, but I think it made us feel a little bit better to say it. Setting aside her needlework, Miss Peregrine rose and hobbled to the window. Her gait was rigid and awkward, as if one of her legs was shorter than the other. She looked out at the yard, at the kids playing. The children mustn't hear of this, she said. Not yet, at least. It would only upset them. Okay, whatever you think. She stood quietly at the glass for a while, her shoulders trembling. When she finally turned to face me again, she was composed and businesslike. Well, Mr. Portman, she said briskly, I think you've been adequately interrogated. You must have questions of your own. Only about 1,000. She pulled a watch from her pocket and consulted it. We have some time before supper hour. I hope that will prove sufficient to enlighten you. Miss Peregrine paused and cocked her head. Abruptly, she strode to the sitting room door and threw it open to find Emma crouched on the other side, her face red and streaked with tears. She'd heard everything. Miss Bloom, have you been eavesdropping? Emma struggled to her feet, letting out a sob. Polite persons do not listen to conversations that were not meant for... But Emma was already running from the room, and Miss Peregrine cut herself short with a frustrated sigh. That was most unfortunate. I'm afraid she's quite sensitive as regards to your grandfather. I noticed, I said. Why were they... When Abraham left to fight in the war, he took all our hearts with him, but Miss Bloom's especially. Yes, they were admirers, paramours, sweethearts. I began to understand why Emma had been so reluctant to believe me. It would mean, in all likelihood, that I was here to deliver bad news about my grandfather. Miss Peregrine clapped her hands as if breaking a spell. Ah, well, she said, it can't be helped. I followed her out of the room to the staircase. Miss Peregrine climbed it with grim resolve, holding the banister with both hands to pull herself up one step at a time, refusing any help. When we reached the landing, she led me down the hall to the library. It looked like a classroom now, a real one, with desks arranged in a row and chalkboard in one corner, and books dusted and organized on the shelves. Miss Peregrine pointed to a desk and said, "Sit," so I squeezed into it. She took her place at the front of the room and faced me. Allow me to give you a brief primer. I think you'll find the answers to most of your questions contained herein. Okay. The composition of the human species is infinitely more diverse than most humans suspect, she began. The real taxonomy of Homo sapiens is a secret known to only a few, of whom you will now be one. At base, it is a simple dichotomy. There are the choral folk, the teeming mass of common people who make up humanity's great bulk, and there is the hidden branch, the crypto-sapiens, if you will, who are called Syndragast, or peculiar spirit, in the venerable language of my ancestors. As you have no doubt surmised, we here are the latter type. I bobbed my head as if I understood, though she'd already lost me. Hoping to slow her down a little, I asked a question. But why don't people know about you? Are you the only ones? There are peculiars all over the world, she said, though our numbers are much diminished from what they once were. Those who remain live in hiding as we do. She lapsed into a soft, regretful voice. There was a time when we could mix openly with common folk. In some corners of the world, we were regarded as shamans and mystics, consulted in times of trouble. A few cultures have retained this harmonious relationship with our people, though only in places where both modernity and the major religions have failed to gain a foothold, such as the black magic island of Ambrim in the New Hebrides. But the larger world turned against us long ago. The Muslims drove us out. The Christians burned us as witches. Even the pagans of Wales and Ireland eventually decided that we were all malevolent fairies and shape-shifting ghosts. So why didn't you just, I don't know, make your own country somewhere? Go and live by yourselves. If only it had been that simple, she said. Peculiar traits often skip a generation, or 10. Peculiar children are not always, or even usually, born to peculiar parents, and peculiar parents do not always, or even usually, bear peculiar children. Can you imagine, in a world so afraid of otherness, why this would be a danger to all peculiar kind? Because normal parents would be freaked out if their kids started to, throw fire? Exactly, Mr. Portman. The peculiar offspring of common parents are often abused and neglected in the most horrific ways. It wasn't so many centuries ago that the parents of peculiar children simply assumed that their real sons or daughters had been made off with and replaced with changelings. That is, enchanted and malevolent, not to mention entirely fictitious lookalikes, which in darker times was considered a license to abandon the poor children, if not kill them outright. That's awful. Extremely. Something had to be done, so people like myself created places where young peculiars could live apart from common folk, physically and temporally isolated enclaves like this one, of which I am enormously proud. People like yourself? We peculiars are blessed with skills that common people lack. As infinite in combination and variety as others are in the pigmentation of their skin or the appearance of their facial features. That said, some skills are common, like reading thoughts, and others are rare, such as the way I can manipulate time. Time? I thought you turned into a bird. To be sure, and therein lies the key to my skill. Only birds can manipulate time. Therefore, all time manipulators must be able to take the form of a bird. She said this so seriously, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a moment to process. Birds are time travelers? I felt a goofy smile spread across my face. Miss Peregrine nodded soberly. Most, however, slip back and forth only occasionally by accident. We who can manipulate time fields consciously, and not only for ourselves but for others, are known as imbreens. We create temporal loops in which peculiar folk can live indefinitely. A loop, I repeated, remembering my grandfather's command. Find the bird in the loop. Is that what this place is? Yes, though you may better know it as the 3rd of September, 1940. I leaned toward her over the little desk. What do you mean? It's only the one day? It repeats? Over and over. though our experience of it is continuous. Otherwise, we would have no memory of the last, 70 years that we've resided here. That's amazing, I said. Of course, we were here on Cairnholm a decade or more before the 3rd of September, 1940, physically isolated, thanks to the island's unique geography. But it wasn't until that date that we also needed temporal isolation. Why is that? Because otherwise we all would have been killed. By the bomb. Assuredly so. I gazed at the surface of the desk. It was all starting to make sense, though just barely. Are there other loops besides this one? Many, she said, and nearly all the Imbrines who mother over them are friends of mine. Let me see. There's Miss Gannett in Ireland in June of 1770, Miss Nightjar in Swansea on April 3rd, 1901, Miss Avocet and Miss Bunting together in Derbyshire on St. Swithin's Day of 1867, Miss Tree Creeper, I don't remember where exactly. Oh, and dear Miss Finch. Somewhere I have a lovely photograph of her. Miss Peregrine rustled a massive photo album down from a shelf and set it before me on the desk. She leaned over my shoulder as she turned the stiff pages, looking for a certain picture, but pausing to linger over others, her voice tinged with dreamy nostalgia. As they flicked by, I recognized photos from the smashed trunk in the basement and from my grandfather's cigar box. Miss Peregrine had collected them all. It was strange to think that she'd shown these same pictures to my grandfather all those years ago, when he was my age, maybe right here in this room, at this desk, and now she was showing them to me, as if somehow I'd stepped into his past. Finally, she came to a photo of an ethereal-looking woman with a plump little bird perched on her hand, and said, "This is Miss Finch and her auntie, Miss Finch." The woman and the bird seemed to be communicating. "How could you tell them apart?" I asked. The elder Miss Finch preferred to stay a Finch most of all the time, which was just as well, really. She never was much of a conversationalist. Miss Peregrine turned a few more pages, this time landing on a group portrait of women and children gathered humorlessly around a paper moon. "Ah, yes, I nearly forgot about this one." She slipped the photo out of its album sleeve and held it up reverently. "The lady in front there, that's Miss Avocet. She's as close to royalty as we peculiars have. They tried for 50 years to elect her leader of the Council of Imbrines, but she would never give up teaching at the academy she and Miss Bunting founded. Today, there's not an Imbrine worth her wings who didn't pass under Miss Avocet's tutelage at one time, myself included. In fact, if you look closely, you might recognize that little girl in the glasses." I squinted. The face she pointed to was dark and slightly blurred. "Is that you?" "I was one of the youngest Miss Avocet ever took on," she said proudly. "What about the boys in the picture?" I said. "They look even younger than you." Miss Peregrine's expression darkened. "You're referring to my misguided brothers. Rather than split us up, they came along to the academy with me. Mollycoddled like a pair of little princes they were. I dare say it's what turned them rotten." "They weren't Imbrines?" "Oh, no," she huffed. "Only women are born Imbrines, and thank heaven for that. Males lack the seriousness of temperament required of persons with such grave responsibilities. We Imbrines must scour the countryside for young peculiars in need, steer clear of those who would do us harm, and keep our wards fed, clothed, hidden, and steeped in the lore of our people. And as if that weren't enough, we must also ensure that our loop reset each day like clockwork." "What happens if they don't?" She raised a fluttering hand to her brow and staggered back, pantomiming horror. "Catastrophe. Cataclysm. Disaster. I dare not even think of it. Fortunately, the mechanism by which loops are reset is a simple one. One of us must cross through the entryway every so often. This keeps it pliable, you see. The ingress point is a bit like a hole in fresh dough. If you don't poke a finger into it now and then, the thing may just close up on its own. And if there's no ingress or egress, no valve through which may be vented the various pressures that accrue naturally in a closed temporal system, she made a little poof gesture with her hands, as if miming the explosion of a firecracker. Well, the whole thing becomes unstable. She bent over the album again and riffled through its pages. Speaking of which, I may have a picture of... Yes, here it is. An ingress point, if ever there was one. She pulled another picture from its sleeve. This is Miss Finch in one of her wards in the magnificent entryway to Miss Finch's loop, in a rarely used portion of the London Underground. When it resets, the tunnel fills with the most terrific glow. I've always thought our own rather modest by comparison, she said with a hint of envy. Just to make sure I understand, I said, if today is September 3rd, 1940, then tomorrow is also September 3rd, 1940? Well, for a few of the loop's 24 hours, it's September 2nd, but yes, it's the 3rd. So tomorrow never comes. In a manner of speaking. Outside, a distant clap of what sounded like thunder echoed, and the darkening window rattled in its frame. Miss Peregrine looked up and again drew out her watch. I'm afraid that's all the time I have at the moment. I do hope you'll stay for supper. I said that I would. That my father might be wondering where I was hardly crossed my mind. I squeezed out from behind the desk and began following her to the door. But then another question occurred to me, one that had been nagging at me for a long time. Was my grandfather really running from the Nazis when he came here? He was, she said. A number of children came to us during those awful years leading up to the war. There was so much upheaval. She looked pained, as if the memory was still fresh. I found Abraham at a camp for displaced persons on the mainland. He was a poor, tortured boy, but so strong. I knew at once that he belonged with us. I felt relieved. At least that part of his life was as I had understood it to be. There was one more thing I wanted to ask, though, and I didn't quite know how to put it. Was he, my grandfather, was he like us? I nodded. She smiled strangely. He was like you, Jacob. And she turned and hobbled toward the stairs. Miss Peregrine insisted that I wash off the bog mud before sitting down to dinner, and asked Emma to run me a bath. I think she hoped that by talking to me a little, Emma would start to feel better, but she wouldn't even look at me. I watched as she ran cold water into the tub and then warmed it with her bare hands, swirling them around until steam rose. That is awesome, I said. But she left without saying a word in response. Once I'd turned the water thoroughly brown, I toweled off and found a change of clothes hanging from the back of the door. Baggy tweed pants, a button-up shirt, and a pair of suspenders that were far too short, but that I couldn't figure out how to adjust. I was left with the choice of wearing the pants either around my ankles or hitched up to my belly button. I decided the latter was lesser of evils, so I went downstairs to have what would likely be the strangest meal of my life while dressed like a clown without makeup. Dinner was a dizzying blur of names and faces, many of them half remembered from photographs and my grandfather's long-ago descriptions. When I came into the dining room, the kids, who'd been clamoring noisily for seats around the long table, froze and stared at me. I got the feeling they didn't get a lot of dinner guests. Miss Peregrine, already seated at the head of the table, stood up and used the sudden quiet as an opportunity to introduce me. For those of you who haven't already had the pleasure of meeting him, she announced, this is Abraham's grandson, Jacob. He is our honored guest and has come a very long way to be here. I hope you will treat him accordingly. Then she pointed to each person in the room and recited their names, most of which I immediately forgot, as happens when I'm nervous. The introductions were followed by a barrage of questions, which Miss Peregrine batted away with rapid-fire efficiency. Is Jacob going to stay with us? Not to my knowledge. Where's Abe? Abe is busy in America. Why does Jacob got Victor's trousers on? Victor doesn't need them anymore, and Mr. Portman's are being washed. What's Abe doing in America? At this question, I saw Emma, who had been glowering in a corner, rise from her chair and stalk out of the room. The others, apparently used to her volatile moods, paid no attention. Never mind what Abe's doing, Miss Peregrine snapped. When's he coming back? Never mind that too. Now let's eat. Everyone stampeded to their seats. Thinking I'd found an empty chair, I went to sit and felt a fork jab my thigh. Excuse me, cried Millard. But Miss Peregrine made him give it up anyway, sending him out to put on clothes. How many times must I tell you, she called after him. Polite persons do not take their supper in the nude. Kids with kitchen duty appeared bearing trays of food, all covered with gleaming silver tops so that you couldn't see what was inside, sparking wild speculation about what might be for dinner. Otter's Wellington, one boy cried. Salted kitten and shrew's liver, another said, to which the younger children responded with gagging sounds. But when the covers were finally lifted, a feast of kingly proportions was revealed. A roasted goose, its flesh a perfect golden brown, a whole salmon, and a whole cod, each outfitted with lemons and fresh dill and pats of melting butter, a bowl of steamed mussels, platters of roasted vegetables, loaves of bread still cooling from the oven, and all manners of jellies and sauces I didn't recognize but that looked delicious. It all glowed invitingly in the flicker of gaslight lamps, a world away from the oily stews of indeterminate origin I'd been choking down at the priest's hole. I hadn't eaten since breakfast and proceeded to stuff myself silly. It shouldn't have surprised me that peculiar children have peculiar eating habits, but between forkfuls of food, I found myself sneaking glances around the room. Olive, the levitating girl, had to be belted into a chair screwed to the floor so that she wouldn't float up to the ceiling. So the rest of us, who wouldn't be plagued by insects, Hugh, the boy who had bees living in his stomach, ate under a large mosquito net at a table for one in the corner. Claire, a doll-like girl with immaculate golden curls, sat next to Miss Peregrine, but ate not a morsel. Aren't you hungry? I asked her. Claire don't eat with the rest of us, Hugh volunteered, a bee escaping from his mouth. She's embarrassed. I am not, she said, glaring at him. Yeah? Then eat something. No one here is embarrassed of their gift, Miss Peregrine said. Miss Densmore simply prefers to dine alone. Isn't that right, Miss Densmore? The girl stared at the empty place before her, clearly wishing that all the attention would vanish. Claire has a back mouth, explained Millard, who sat beside me now in a smoking jacket, and nothing else. A what? Go on, show him, someone said. Soon, everyone at the table was pressuring Claire to eat something, and finally, just to shut them up, she did. A leg of goose was set before her. She turned around in her chair, and gripping its arms, she bent over backward, dipping the back of her head to the plate. I heard a distinct smacking sound, and when she lifted her head again, a giant bite had disappeared from the goose leg. Beneath her golden hair was a set of sharp-toothed jaws. Suddenly, I understood the strange picture of Claire that I'd seen in Miss Peregrine's album, to which the photographer had devoted 2 panels, one for her daintily pretty face, and another for the curls that so thoroughly masked the back of her head. Claire turned forward and crossed her arms, annoyed that she'd let herself be talked into such a humiliating demonstration. She sat in silence while the others peppered me with questions. After Miss Peregrine had dismissed a few more about my grandfather, the children turned to other subjects. They seemed especially interested in what life the 21st century was like. "What sort of flying motor cars do you have?" asked a pubescent boy named Horace, who wore a dark suit that made him look like an apprentice undertaker. "None," I said. "Not yet, anyway." "Have they built cities on the moon?" another boy asked hopefully. "We left some garbage and a flag there in the 60s, but that's about it." "Does Britain still rule the world?" Not exactly." They seemed disappointed. Sensing an opportunity, Miss Peregrine said, "You see, children, the future isn't so grand after all. Nothing wrong with the good old here and now." I got the feeling this was something she often tried to impress upon them, with little success. But it got me wondering, just how long had they been here in the good old here and now? "Do you mind if I ask how old you all are?" I said. "I'm 83, said Horace. Olive raised her hand excitedly. "I'll be 75 and a half next week." I wondered how they kept track of the months and years if the days never changed. "I'm either 117 or 118, said a heavy-lidded boy named Enoch. He looked no more than 13. "I lived in another loop before this one," he explained. "I'm nearly 87, said Millard, with his mouth full of goose drippings, and as he spoke, a half-chewed mass quavered in his invisible jaw for all to see. There were groans as people covered their eyes and looked away. Then it was my turn. I was 16, I told them. I saw a few kids' eyes widen. Olive laughed in surprise. It was strange to them that I should be so young, but what was strange to me was how young they seemed. I knew plenty of 80-year-olds in Florida, and these kids acted nothing like them. It was as if the constants of their lives here, the unvarying days, this perpetual deathless summer, had arrested their emotions as well as their bodies, sealing them in their youth like Peter Pan and his Lost Boys. A sudden boom sounded from outside, the second one this evening, but louder and closer than the first, rattling silverware and plates. "Hurry up and finish, everyone," Miss Peregrine sang out. And no sooner had she said it than another concussion jolted the house, throwing a framed picture off the wall behind me. "What is that?" I said. "It's those damn Jerrys again," growled Olive, thumping her little fist on the table, clearly an imitation of some ill-tempered adult. Then I heard what sounded like a buzzer going off somewhere far away, and it suddenly occurred to me what was happening. This was the night of September 3rd, 1940, and in a little while, a bomb was going to fall from the sky and blow a giant hole in the house. The buzzer was an air raid siren, sounding from the ridge. "We have to get out of here," I said, panic rising in my throat. "We have to go before the bomb hits." "He doesn't know," giggled Olive. "He thinks we're going to die." "It's only the changeover," said Millard, with a shrug of his smoking jacket. "No reason to get your knickers in a twist." "This happens every night?" Miss Peregrine nodded. "Every single evening," she said. Somehow, though, I was not reassured. "May we go outside and show Jacob?" said Hugh. "Yes, may we?" Claire begged, suddenly enthused after 20 minutes of sulking. "The changeover is ever so beautiful." Miss Peregrine demurred, pointing out that they hadn't yet finished their dinners, but the children pleaded with her until she relented. "All right, so long as you all wear your masks," she said. The children burst out of their seats and ran from the room, leaving poor Olive behind until someone took pity and came to unbelt her from her chair. I ran after them through the house into the wood-paneled foyer, where they each grabbed something from a cabinet before bounding out the door. Miss Peregrine gave me one too, and I stood turning it over in my hands. It looked like a sagging face of black rubber, with wide glass portholes like eyes that were frozen in shock, and a droopy snout that ended in a perforated canister. "Go ahead," said Miss Peregrine. "Put it on." Then I realized what it was. A gas mask. I strapped it over my face and followed her out onto the lawn, where the children stood scattered like chess pieces on an unmarked board, anonymous behind their upturned masks, watching billows of black smoke roll across the sky. Treetops burned in the hazy distance. The drone of unseen airplanes seemed to come from everywhere. Now and then came a muffled blast I could feel in my chest, like the thump of a second heart, followed by waves of broiling heat, like someone opening and closing an oven right in front of me. I ducked at each concussion, but the kids never so much as flinched. Instead, they sang, their lyrics timed perfectly to the rhythm of the bombs. "Run, rabbit, run, 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 run. Bang, 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 bang goes the farmer's gun. He'll get by without his rabbit pie, so run, rabbit, run, rabbit, run." Bright tracer bullets scored the heavens just as the song ended. The kids applauded like onlookers at a fireworks display, violent slashes of color reflected in their masks. This nightly assault had become such a regular part of their lives that they'd ceased to think of it as something terrifying. In fact, the photograph I'd seen of it in Miss Peregrine's album had been labeled "Our Beautiful Display," and in its own morbid way, I suppose it was. It began to drizzle, as if all that flying metal had riven holes in the clouds. The concussions came less frequently. The attack seemed to be ending. The children started to leave. I thought we were going back inside, but they passed the front door and headed for another part of the yard. "Where are we going?" I asked two masked kids. They said nothing, but seemed to sense my anxiety. They took me gently by the hands and led me along with the others. We rounded the house to the back corner, where everyone was gathering around a giant topiary. This one wasn't a mythical creature, though, but a man reposing in the grass, one arm supporting him, the other pointing to the sky. It took me a moment before I realized it was a leafy replica of Michelangelo's fresco of Adam from the Sistine Chapel. Considering that it was made from bushes, it was really impressive. You could almost make out the placid expression on Adam's face, which had two blooming gardenias for eyes. I saw the wild-haired girl standing nearby. She wore a flower print dress that had been patched so many times it almost looked like a quilt. I went over to her and, pointing to Adam, said, "Did you make this?" The girl nodded. "How?" She bent down and held one of her palms above the grass. A few seconds later, a hand-shaped section of blades wriggled and stretched and grew until they were brushing the bottom of her palm. "That," I said, "is crazy." Clearly, I was not at my most articulate. Someone shushed me. The children were all standing silently with their necks craned, pointing at a section of sky. I looked up but could see only clouds of smoke, the flickering orange of fires reflecting against them. Then I heard a single airplane engine cut through the rest. It was close, and getting closer. Panic flooded me. This is the night they were killed. Not just the night, but the moment. Could it be, I wondered, that these children died every evening only to be resurrected by the loop? Like some Sisyphean suicide cult, condemned to be blown up and stitched back together for eternity? Something small and gray parted the clouds and came hurtling toward us. A rock, I thought, but rocks don't whistle as they fall. Run, rabbit, run. I would have, but now there was no time. All I could do was scream and dive to the ground for cover. But there was no cover. So I hit the grass and threw my arms over my head, as if somehow that would keep it attached to my body. I clenched my jaw and shut my eyes and held my breath, but instead of a deafening blast that I was bracing for, everything went completely, profoundly quiet. Suddenly, there were no growling engines, no whistling bombs, no pops of distant guns. It was as if someone had muted the world. Was I dead? I uncovered my head and slowly looked behind me. The wind-bent boughs of trees were frozen in place. The sky was a photograph of arrested flames licking a cloud bank. Drops of rain hung suspended before my eyes. And in the middle of the circle of children, like the object of some arcane ritual, there hovered a bomb, its downward-facing tip seemingly balanced on Adam's outstretched finger. Then, like a movie that burns in the projector while you're watching it, a bloom of hot and perfect whiteness spread out before me and swallowed everything. The first thing I heard when I could hear again was laughter. Then the white faded away, and I saw that we were all arranged around Adam, just as we had been before. But now the bomb was gone, and the night was quiet, and the only light in the cloudless sky was a full moon. Miss Peregrine appeared above me and held out her hand. I took it, stumbling to my feet in a daze. "Please accept my apologies," she said. "I should have better prepared you." She couldn't hide her smile, though, and neither could the other kids as they stripped off their masks. I was pretty sure that I'd just been hazed. I felt lightheaded and out of sorts. "I should probably head home for the night," I said to Miss Peregrine. "My dad'll worry." Then I added quickly, "I can go home, right?" "Of course you can," she replied, and in a loud voice asked for a volunteer to escort me back to the cairn. To my surprise, Emma stepped forward. Miss Peregrine seemed pleased. "Are you sure about her?" I whispered to the headmistress. "A few hours ago, she was ready to slit my throat." "Miss Bloom may be hot-tempered, but she is one of my most trusted wards," she replied, "and I think you and she may have a few things to discuss away from curious ears." 5 minutes later, the two of us were on our way. Only this time, my hands weren't tied, and she wasn't poking a knife in my spine. A few of the younger kids trailed us after, as far as the edge of the yard. They wanted to know whether I'd be back again tomorrow. I made vague assurances, but I could hardly wrap my mind around what was happening at this moment, much less in the future. We passed into the dark woods alone. When the house had disappeared behind us, Emma held out an upturned palm, flicked her wrist, and a petite ball of fire flared to life just above her fingers. She held it before her like a waiter carrying a tray, lighting the path and casting our twin shadows across the trees. "Have I told you how cool that is?" I said, trying to break a silence that grew more awkward by the second. "It isn't cool at all," she replied, swinging the flame close enough that I could feel its radiating heat. I dodged it and fell back a few paces. I meant it's cool that you could do that." "Well, if you'd speak properly, I might understand you," she snapped, then stopped walking. We stood facing each other from a careful distance. "You don't have to be afraid of me," she said. "Oh yeah? How do I know you don't think I'm some evil creature and this is just a plot to get me alone so you can finally kill me?" "Don't be stupid," she said. You came unannounced, a stranger I didn't recognize, and chased after me like a madman. What was I supposed to think? Fine, I get it, I said, though I didn't really mean it. She dropped her eyes and began digging a little hole in the dirt with the tip of her boot. The flame in her hand changed color, fading from orange to a cool indigo. It's not true what I said. I did recognize you. She looked up at me. You look so much like him. People tell me that sometimes. I'm sorry I said all those terrible things earlier. I didn't want to believe you, that you were who you said. I knew what it would mean. It's okay, I replied. When I was growing up, I wanted so much to meet all of you. Now that it's finally happening, I shook my head. I'm just sorry it has to be because of this. And then she rushed at me and threw her arms around my neck, the flame in her hand snuffing out just before she touched me, her skin hot where she'd held it. We stood like that in the darkness for a while. Me and this teenaged old woman, this rather beautiful girl who had loved my grandfather when he was the age I am now. There was nothing I could do but put my arms around her too, so I did. And after a while, I guess we were both crying. I heard her take a deep breath in the dark, and then she broke away. The fire flared back to life in her hand. Sorry about that, she said. I'm not usually so... Don't worry about it. We should be getting on. Lead the way, I said. We walked through the woods in a comfortable silence. Then we came to the bog, and she said, Step only where I step. And I did, planting my feet in her prints. Bog gashes flared up in green pyres in the distance, as if in sympathy with Emma's light. We reached the cairn and ducked inside, shuffling in single file to the rear chamber and then out again to a world shrouded in mist. She guided me back to the path, and when we reached it, she laced her fingers through mine and squeezed. We were quiet for a moment. Then she turned and went back, the fog swallowing her so quickly that for a moment I wondered if she'd been there at all. Returning to town, I half expected to find horse-drawn wagons roaming the streets. Instead, I was welcomed by the hum of generators and the glow of TV screens behind cottage windows. I was home, such as it was. Kev was manning the bar again and raised a glass in my direction as I came in. None of the men in the pub offered to lynch me. All seemed right with the world. I went upstairs to find Dad asleep in front of his laptop at our little table. When I shut the door, he woke with a start. Hi, hey, you're out late. Or are you? What time is it? I don't know, I said. Before 9, I think. The Jennies are still on. He stretched and rubbed his eyes. What did you do today? I was hoping I'd see you for dinner. Just explore the old house some more. Find anything good? Not really, I said, realizing that I probably should have bothered to concoct a more elaborate cover story. He looked at me strangely. Where did you get those? Get what? Your clothes, he said. I looked down and realized I'd completely forgotten about the tweed pants and suspenders outfit I was wearing. Oh, I found them in the house, I said, because I didn't have time to think of a less weird answer. Aren't they cool? He grimaced. You put on clothes that you found? Jake, that's unsanitary. And what happened to your jeans and jacket? I needed to change the subject. They got super dirty, so I trailed off, making a point of noticing the document on his computer screen. Whoa, is that your book? How's it coming? He slapped the laptop shut. My book isn't the issue right now. What's important is our time here being therapeutic for you. I'm not sure that spending your days alone in that old house is really what Dr. Golan had in mind. when he green-lighted this trip. Wow, I think that was the record, I said. What? The longest streak ever of you not mentioning my psychiatrist. I pretended to look at my non-existent wristwatch. 4 days, 5 hours, and 26 minutes? I sighed. Oh, it was good while it lasted. That man has been a great help to you, he said. God only knows the state you'd be in right now if we hadn't found him. You're right, Dad. Dr. Golan did help me. But that doesn't mean he has to control every aspect of my life. I mean, Jesus, you and Mom might as well buy me one of those little bracelets that said, "What would Golan do?" That way I can ask myself before I do anything. Before I take a dump, how would Dr. Golan want me to take this dump? Should I bank it off the side or go straight down the middle? What would be the most psychologically beneficial dump I could take? Dad didn't say anything for a few seconds, and when he did, his voice was all low and gravelly. He told me I was going birding with him the next day, whether I liked it or not. When I replied that he was sadly mistaken, he got up and went downstairs to the pub. I thought he'd be drinking or something, so I went to change out of my clown clothes, but a few minutes later, he knocked on my bedroom door and said there was someone on the phone for me. I figured it was Mom, so I gritted my teeth and followed him downstairs to the phone booth in the far corner of the pub. He handed me the receiver and went to sit at a table. I slid the door closed. Hello? I just spoke to your father, a man said. He sounded a little upset. It was Dr. Golan. I wanted to say that he and my dad could both stuff it up their asses, but I knew this situation required some tact. If I pissed Golan off now, it would be the end of my trip. I couldn't leave yet, not with so much more to learn about the peculiar children. So I played along and explained what I'd been up to, all except the kids in a time loop part, and tried to make it sound like I was coming around to the idea that there was nothing special about the island or my grandfather. It was like a mini session over the phone. I hope you're not just telling me what I want to hear, he said. That had become his standard line. Maybe I should come out there and check on you. I could use a little vacation. How does that sound? Please be joking, I prayed. I'm okay, really, I said. Relax, Jacob. I'm only kidding. Though Lord knows I could use some time away from the office. And actually, I believe you. You do sound okay. In fact, just now, I told your father that probably the best thing he could do is give you a little breathing room and let you sort things out on your own. Really? You've had your parents and me hovering over you for so long. At a certain point, it becomes counterproductive. Well, I appreciate that. He said something else I couldn't quite hear. There was a lot of noise on his end. It's hard to hear you, I said. Are you in a mall or something? The airport, he replied, picking up my sister. Anyway, all I said was to enjoy yourself, explore, and don't worry too much. I'll see you soon, all right? Thanks again, Dr. G. As I hung up the phone, I felt bad for having ragged on him earlier. That was twice now he stuck up for me when my own parents wouldn't. My dad was nursing a beer across the room. I stopped by his table on my way upstairs. About tomorrow, I said. Do what you want, I guess. Are you sure? He shrugged sullenly. Doctor's orders. I'll be home for dinner, promise. He just nodded. I left him in the bar and went up to bed. Falling asleep, my thoughts drifted to the peculiar children and the first question they'd asked after Miss Peregrine had introduced me. Is Jacob going to stay with us? At the time, I thought, of course not. But why not? If I never went home, what exactly would I be missing? I pictured my cold, cavernous house, my friendless town full of bad memories, the utterly unremarkable life that had been mapped out for me. It had never once occurred to me, I realized, to refuse it. End of chapter 6.